The wheel had not turned in 22 years. It was still there when Ezra found it, the overshot wheel on the creek at Sable Ford, iron and timber, seized with rust, and the particular stillness of something that has been stopped for so long it has forgotten what it was for. The millstones were still in place on the upper floor. The stone foundation walls were sound. The timbers had held. His son had taken his keys on a Tuesday morning and driven him to a care facility near the county line with a prepared speech and a bag of his things. That was 19 days before the auction. Ezra paid $7 for the mill, and nobody else raised their hand, and what he found inside the stone foundation wall of that old building, sealed behind a false panel for nearly a century, changed everything he thought he understood about what he had inherited and what he was owed. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Ezra's grandfather had built a mill. That was the fact at the center of everything. The fact that Ezra had grown up understanding not as history, but as a living thing, a presence in the family, the way certain stories are presences, told at tables and on porches, and passed from one generation to the next, not because they were comfortable, but because they were necessary. Solomon Webb had been a free man in the rural South, in an era when that status was legally established and practically contested at every turn, and he had built a grist mill on the creek at Sable Ford in 1887 with his own hands and the hands of the men who worked alongside him. And he had operated it for 44 years, supplying grain to farms across half the county, regardless of who owned them, because grain did not have a politics, and a working mill in a farming community was as close to essential as a man-made thing could get. The mill was lost in 1931. The circumstances were the circumstances of that era and that place, which is to say they were not circumstances at all, but the systematic application of economic and legal pressure by people who understood that black land ownership and black economic independence were threats to an order they intended to maintain. Solomon Webb lost the mill when Ezra's father was 6 years old. The family left Sable Ford and did not return for a generation. What they took with them was the knowledge. Ezra's grandfather spent the rest of his life as a millwright's assistant in a city 2 states north, working on other men's equipment, keeping alive in his hands the understanding of how water moved a wheel, and how a wheel moved a stone, and how a stone moved against grain with the particular pressure that turned raw harvest into something a family could eat. He dressed millstones in his spare time, the meticulous process of cutting and renewing the grinding furrows that determined the quality of the meal, working with the small iron-headed pick that he had made himself, the handle turned from hickory, the head balanced in the particular way that suited his hand. When Solomon Webb died, he left that pick to Ezra's father. When Ezra's father died, he left it to Ezra. Ezra had carried it in his jacket pocket every working day for 34 years. He had opened his own mill at 42 on a different creek in a different county, leasing the building at first and then buying it, a small operation serving the farmers and the specialty grain buyers and the growing number of people who wanted stone-ground meal from someone who understood what stone-ground meant. He was not a wealthy man. He was a man with a skill that had come to him through 3 generations of deliberate preservation, and a mill that ran because he knew how to make it run and because he worked it the way his grandfather had worked it, with complete attention to the water and the stone and the grain, the 3 elements that made the whole thing go. His wife Vera had understood the mill the way she understood most things about Ezra, which was from the inside, having watched him long enough to know what the work was and what it cost and what it returned, and having decided, early in their marriage, that the return was worth the cost. She ran the business side, the orders and the accounts and the conversations with buyers that Ezra found difficult because his attention was always partly on the water and the stone and the grain, and only partly on anything else. Vera had grown up in a family that understood work the way the Webb family understood work, as a form of dignity that nobody could authorize and nobody could revoke, and she had recognized in Ezra's mill the same thing, the same claim on a person's own competence, and the same refusal to let that competence be defined by someone else's assessment of its value. She had never told him this directly. She had shown it by showing up every morning for 34 years and doing the half of the work that his hands could not do. She had died 2 years before the story begins, after a brief illness that moved faster than either of them had been prepared for, and Ezra had not known until she was gone how much of the structure of his daily life had been maintained by her quiet competence. The grief had a quality of disorientation to it that surprised him, because he had thought he understood what losing her would feel like, and found that understanding had been entirely inadequate. In the months after Vera's death, when Ezra was not fully himself and knew it and could not do much about it, Preston had moved in with his management. Not aggressively, gradually. Each step announced as practical, necessary in Ezra's best interest, offered in the tone of someone who had done the calculation and arrived at the only reasonable conclusion. Preston was 53, Ezra's son, a branch manager at a regional bank, a man who had spent his adult life constructing a distance from the kind of work his father did, not out of shame exactly, but out of a conviction that the family had paid enough dues to the hard and physical and precarious, that education and professional standing were the correct destination, and the mill was a detour that his father had not yet understood was over. He was not cruel. He was embarrassed in the deep and defended way of someone who has decided that embarrassment is the same as having standards, and he had spent enough years with that decision that he could no longer see it clearly. After Vera died, Preston began managing. The accounts first, then the schedule, then the suggestion that the mill lease was expiring at an inconvenient time, and that given Ezra's age, it might be sensible to let it lapse rather than renew. Each step presented as practical, reasonable, in Ezra's best interest, and Ezra, in the fog of grief and the unfamiliar silence of a house without Vera, had not pushed back with the force he would have found if he had been more himself. The mill went. Then the house. Camille was 48. Ezra's daughter, a social worker in a city 3 hours away who felt everything clearly and acted on very little of it, who called every week and was present and loving on those calls, and did not come when she should have come, and did not say what she should have said, and knew both of those things, and carried them. On a Tuesday morning, Preston arrived at the rental apartment with the car running and the speech prepared. He said there was a place that had been recommended with good staff and activities and people Ezra's age, and that it was just while some things were worked out. Camille was in the passenger seat. Ezra came to the door and looked at his son and then looked past him to where Camille sat with her coat on, and she was smoothing a crease in her left sleeve with the fingers of her right hand, pressing the fabric flat and then pressing it again. The same motion repeated, her eyes on her own hands and not on her father's face. Ezra looked at her hands for a moment. He went to the bedside table and picked up the millstone dresser's pick. It fit in his jacket pocket the way it had always fit, the hickory handle warm from the room, the iron head settled in the familiar place against his hip. He had carried it since his father's funeral, and he was not leaving without it. He did not say what he might have said. They drove 40 minutes to a facility that was everything Preston had described and nothing that Ezra intended to remain in. The room was pleasant. The staff were kind. The other residents were people in various states of accommodation with where they had ended up. Ezra was courteous to all of them and spent his evenings at the table by the window, working through what he knew and what he had and what he was going to do about his situation. The view from the window was a parking lot, and beyond it a road, and beyond that a strip of commercial buildings that could have been anywhere. He looked at it each evening and thought about the creek at Sable Ford, which he had not seen in 40 years, but which his grandfather had described often enough, and specifically enough, that Ezra could picture it. The bend where the current slowed, the drop that gave the mill its head of water, the sound of it in different seasons. He thought about water a great deal in those 19 days. Water was patient in a way that nothing else he knew was patient. It went around obstacles rather than through them, and it arrived eventually regardless, and it did not take the obstacle personally or spend energy on resentment of it. He had spent 34 years working with water, and he understood it as well as he understood anything, which meant he understood that it always found the low point and it always kept moving. He had a small account that Preston did not have access to, money he had kept separately without exactly deciding to, the way a person who has seen enough of life keeps certain things back without calling it caution. He had his grandfather's pick in his jacket pocket. He had 34 years of understanding of how water and stone and wood worked together to make something useful out of raw material. He had a mind that had spent those 34 years solving problems with what was available, and that had not stopped working simply because his body had been relocated. On the 11th day, he found the county listings at the public library 2 miles from the facility, which he reached on foot in 40 minutes each way without complaint because the walk was useful time. On the 14th day, he read about the abandoned watermill at Sable Ford. He sat at the library computer for a long time after that, reading what there was to read about the property and the town, which was not much, and looking at what aerial photographs existed, which confirmed the creek was still running and the building was still standing. On the 19th day, he was at the county office when it opened, $7 in his coat pocket, and paid for the deed to a watermill on a creek in a town his grandfather had left 90 years before, under circumstances that had never been made right. He did not know yet that they were about to be. The bus let him off at the Sable Ford crossroads on a Wednesday afternoon in early April. The creek was running well from the spring rains. He could hear it before he saw it, and that was the first good sign, because a mill without sufficient water was a building and nothing more. He followed the sound down the track at the edge of the road until the mill came into view through the budding trees. Stone foundation, 2 stories of timber frame above it, the overshot wheel on the creek side with its buckets rusted but present. The flume that fed water onto the top of the wheel collapsed but repairable. The structure sound in the way of things built by people who understood that what they were building had to last, because replacing it was not an option they intended to have. He walked the perimeter twice, the way he always walked a new piece of equipment, looking first and touching second and not yet drawing any conclusions he could not support. Then he stood at the creek bank and watched the water. A miller read water the way a doctor read a patient for what it was currently doing and what it had the capacity to do and where the problems were and what they would cost. Ezra stood there for the better part of 20 minutes, reading the flow, the volume, the seasonal variation implied by the high water marks on the creek bank, the way the current moved around the remnants of the old mill dam, and by the end of those 20 minutes, he had a reasonable picture of what the wheel could do if it was freed and the flume rebuilt. He was still standing there when a voice from the track behind him said, "You are reading that creek like you know what to do with it." Gusta ran the only diner in Sable Ford, a low building on the crossroads that smelled of coffee and the particular combination of cooking smells that accumulates in a place that has been feeding the same community for decades. She was in her late 50s, a stout woman with gray locks, and the unhurried directness of someone who had been at the center of a small community's information and sustenance for long enough that there was very little about people that surprised her. She had a thermos of coffee in her hand, which she had brought because she had seen him come down the track 20 minutes ago and had been watching from the diner window and had decided that whoever was reading that creek that carefully at least deserved a hot drink. She handed him the thermos cup. She said, "What do you see in it?" he told her. The volume, the seasonal consistency implied by the bank markings, the way the current moved, the likely head of water available for the wheel with the flume rebuilt to its original configuration. He told her in the particular terms of a miller talking to a person who had asked, which was different from the terms he used when he was explaining to someone who had not asked and probably did not want to know. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "My grandfather used to bring his corn here, before it closed." He looked at her. She said, "You planning to put it back to work?" He said that was the idea. She said in that case he could have the room above the diner for what she would charge anybody, which was nothing for the first month, because a working mill at Sable Ford was worth more to this town than whatever she would get from the room, and she had the arithmetic to prove it. He moved his things from the facility the following morning without notifying Preston. He left the facility's number with Gusta in case of emergency, which he did not expect, and went to work. The first month was assessment and clearing and the particular physical labor of bringing a space back from decades of closure, a labor that Ezra had not done since he was a young man, and that his 76-year-old body registered clearly and completely. He worked in the mornings when he was freshest and rested in the afternoons, and did not pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise was the kind of thing that put a man of his age in the hospital, and the hospital was not where he intended to be. He started each morning at first light, moving through the building from the ground floor up, cataloging what needed doing and in what order. A working mill had a logic to its restoration the way it had a logic to its operation. You started with the structure that held everything, then the mechanism that moved the power, then the stones that did the work. Getting ahead of the sequence produced problems. Getting behind it produced the same problems. The sequence was not a suggestion. The millstones were in good condition. That was the central fact, established in the first week, and it was the fact that everything else depended on. 2 runner stones and 2 bed stones, all present, none cracked. The grinding surfaces were dulled from years of disuse but dressable, which meant the heart of the operation was intact. A mill without sound millstones was a building with a wheel, which was a curiosity. A mill with sound stones was a working proposition. The wheel bearings needed complete replacement. The flume that delivered water to the top of the wheel had collapsed along its lower third and needed rebuilding from the intake gate down, which was a substantial piece of timber work but straightforward for someone who had built flume sections before, which Ezra had. The gear train connecting the wheel shaft to the millstone spindle needed assessment section by section, some of it replaceable with standard stock from the mill supply company 2 counties over that Ezra had dealt with for 3 decades, and that still had his account on file. He worked through the list item by item. He did not hurry. He did not allow himself to look at the full scope of what remained and feel it as an obstacle rather than a sequence. He had learned that from 34 years of milling, and from his grandfather before that, who had learned it from building the mill in the first place. The work went as fast as the work went, and the only thing that slowed it further was impatience. Gusta brought lunch to the mill 3 days a week without being asked, and set it on the ground floor table without ceremony, and left. Ezra ate it, and went back to work, and did not make anything of either the gesture or the food, because he understood that some people expressed care through consistent practical action, and that acknowledging it too directly made them uncomfortable. He found the panel in the 3rd week. He had been working along the interior of the stone foundation wall on the ground floor, checking the mortar and the drainage, when he noticed a section of the wall near the northeast corner that did not sound the same as the rest when he tapped it. Not hollow exactly. Denser than hollow, but different from solid. He tapped along the wall in both directions from that section, and the difference was clear. A space behind the facing stones that was perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, sealed with mortar that was newer than the surrounding wall, applied at a different time by a different hand. He got the pry bar. The facing stones came away carefully, each one set aside in order. Behind them, recessed into the foundation, a tin box. Dark with age, its surface pitted, but its lid tight and its seams sound. On the lid, scratched into the tin in letters that had been cut deliberately and with effort, S. Webb, Sable Ford Mill, 1931. He sat down on the foundation stone with the box in his lap. He understood, before he opened it, the general shape of what he was holding. He had grown up knowing the story of the mill and the year it was lost, and the name of the man who had built it and lost it. He had not known the man had left something behind. He sat there for a while with the box in his lap and the ground floor of the mill around him, the stone walls that Solomon Webb had laid, the timber above that Solomon Webb had raised, and he thought about what it meant that this man had known, in 1931, that he was losing everything and had taken the time to seal something in the wall of it anyway. He thought about the kind of faith that required, not faith in a particular outcome, faith in the existence of a future person who would come along and find it and know what to do with it, faith that the finding and the knowing were worth preparing for, even when you could not see how or when or by whom. He opened it. Inside, protected by a layer of oilcloth, a folded document that opened into the original land deed for the mill property and 6 acres along the creek, Solomon Webb's name on it in the formal hand of a county clerk from 1887. The paper was brittle at the edges, but the ink was legible, every parcel described and every boundary marked. 6 acres along that creek, belonging in law to Solomon Webb, belonging by law still to whoever held this deed. A set of ledger books, 3 of them, their pages dense with Solomon's careful accounting, the names of farms and families he had supplied across 44 years of operation, the weights and prices and dates, the record of a man who had fed half a county and kept the accounts of it in books that now sat in his grandson's lap on the floor of the same building where the work had been done. A bundle of letters tied with cloth that had mostly disintegrated. He set them aside carefully for later. And beneath everything, a folded piece of paper that was a hand-drawn map, the creek and the mill building marked on it, and within the building an X on the upper floor with a notation beside it in Solomon's hand, French burr, 4 feet diameter, set below the boards for keeping. Ezra looked at the upper floor above him. The boards, the millstones he had already assessed, and beneath them, if Solomon's map was right, a 4th stone, a French burr millstone, the finest grinding stone available, 4 feet across, the kind of stone that produced meal of a quality that ordinary millstones could not match. Hidden when the family understood they were losing everything. Left for whoever came next, who would know what to do with it. The planning and the faith and the specific practical intelligence of that act settled on him all at once, and he sat there for a while longer before he trusted himself to stand. He went through the letters that evening at Gusta's table, with her across from him and the lamp between them. Most were business correspondence, the ordinary paperwork of a working mill. But in the bundle, at the back, one letter that was different. It was addressed to Solomon's youngest son in Solomon's own hand, and it was unsealed, and the flap had never been folded down. He unfolded it carefully. It was dated November of 1931. It described the mill, what it had been and what it had meant, the families it had fed, the years of work, the knowledge that had built it, and near the end, in the second to last line, a sentence that stopped in the middle. Whatever they take from us, they cannot take the knowing of how to. The sentence did not finish. There was a period of blank space after the last word, and then the edge of the page. Whether Solomon had been interrupted, or had simply found that the sentence contained everything it needed to contain without being completed, Ezra could not know. He read it 3 times and understood that he did not need to know. He folded the letter carefully. That evening at Gusta's table, he told her what he had found, all of it, the deed and the ledgers and the letters and the map and the stone beneath the floor. He told it in the order he had found it, which was also something close to the order in which Solomon Webb had built it, the deed first and the business second and the knowledge last of all, the knowing of how to set below the boards where the knowing always lived, in the place beneath the visible surface where the essential things were kept. Gusta listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand was her way, the way of someone who knew that the most useful thing she could do with information was receive it completely before she responded to it. When he finished, she looked at her coffee cup for a moment. She said, "Solomon Webb. My grandfather knew that name. He talked about the Webb Mill. He called it the mill that fed this county. Ezra said he thought that was probably accurate, given what the ledgers showed." She said, "My grandfather brought his corn here when he was a young man. He said the meal from this mill was different from any other mill in 3 counties. He said he never understood why. Ezra said he thought he knew why." She looked at him. He said, "French burr stone. The grain is finer than the stone most mills use. If Solomon had a French burr running, the meal from this place was as good as meal got. Your grandfather was right about the difference. He just did not know what made it." Gusta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And the stone is still there." He said it was. She said, "What are you going to do with the letter?" He said he was going to frame it. She said, "Good." He found the French burr stone where the map said it would be, beneath the boards of the upper floor on the eastern side, wrapped in the remnants of the oilcloth and burlap that Solomon had packed around it before he left. It was intact. 4 feet of French quarry stone, the grain of it still sharp and workable despite nearly a century of waiting beneath the boards of a mill that had been still and dark since the year it was hidden. Ezra stood over it in the upper floor and looked at it for a long time. He thought about Solomon Webb choosing this stone, selecting it over the domestic stones that were cheaper and more common, knowing the quality of what he was installing and what that quality would mean for the people who brought their grain to him. He thought about Solomon hiding it rather than letting it go. A French burr stone was not the kind of thing a man hid unless he believed someone would come back for it who would know what it was and what to do with it. He took the millstone dresser's pick from his jacket pocket. He had not dressed a stone in 12 years. The motion came back not quickly, but correctly, which was better than quickly. The angle of the pick to the stone surface, the rhythm of the striking, the reading of the land pattern that showed where the furrows needed cutting and where they were still serviceable. A millstone dresser's skill lived in the hands and in the hearing as much as the eye, the sound of the pick against the stone telling as much as the sight of what it struck. He worked in the early morning light for 2 hours before he heard Gusta in the stairwell. She came up with 2 cups of coffee and stood in the doorway of the upper floor and looked at him working and said nothing. He knew she was there and did not stop. The pick moved in its pattern, and the stone gave back the sound that told him where the next stroke needed to go, and the morning light through the upper window fell across the French burr and across his hands and across the pick with its hickory handle, worn smooth by 3 generations of the same motion. He worked for another hour. Then he set the pick down on the stone surface and straightened up and took the coffee she held out. Neither of them said anything for a while. Gusta looked at the stone and at the pick resting on it and said, "That is what it sounds like." He said, "Yes." She said, "I did not know it had a sound." He said, "Everything had a sound if you listened for it. If you have made it this far into Ezra's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you." Delia arrived 6 days after Ezra framed Solomon's letter on the ground floor wall. She was 64, a retired schoolteacher from the next county, a tall woman with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on her forehead, and the particular patience of someone who had spent 30 years meeting children exactly where they were. She had lost her rental when her landlord sold the property, and had been staying with her sister and then not staying with her sister, and she had heard through the network of black churches in the region that something was happening at the old Sable Ford watermill, a man putting it back to work, and she had driven over on a Thursday morning to see for herself. She walked through the ground floor of the mill and read Solomon's letter on the wall, and stood in front of it for a long time. Then she walked up to the upper floor and looked at the French burr stone and at the pick resting on its surface and at Ezra working at the gear train near the wheel housing. She said she was a retired teacher and she had no particular mechanical skills, but she was organized and capable and not afraid of hard work, and she was looking for somewhere to be useful. Ezra looked at her over his shoulder. He said the room across the hall from his above the diner was available if she wanted it, and that breakfast was whatever Gusta made, which was always worth eating. She said that sounded fine. She moved in the next day. Within the first week it became clear that organized and capable were substantial understatements. She had the mill's permit applications filed, and the County Historical Society contacted, and the Regional Preservation Office aware of the deed box findings before Ezra had finished replacing the first wheel bearing. She also had, in the evenings, a habit of reading aloud to herself from whatever book she was in the middle of, her voice carrying softly through the wall between their rooms, and Ezra found that he did not mind it, that the sound of a human voice reading in the next room was a thing he had not known he missed until it was there. Delia's particular human moment came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks in, when Ezra came into the ground floor and found her standing in front of Solomon's letter with a piece of chalk and a section of the cleared mill floor, working out what she was going to teach. Not Ezra, not the mill visitors she was already planning for. She was working out for herself, writing dates and names on the floor in chalk, Solomon Webb's years and the history surrounding them, the context of what it meant to build a black-owned mill in 1887 and operate it for 44 years and then lose it in 1931. She was teaching herself, making sure she had it right before she taught anyone else. She did not look up when he came in. He went to get his tools and left her to it. Isaac arrived on a morning in May, on foot, with a backpack and the particular held quality of a young man who has been told no enough times in enough places that his default posture has become the bracing for it. He was 23, 8 months out of a 2-year sentence for a non-violent offense, and he had been looking for work and finding the usual doors, which was to say he had been finding doors that were technically open and practically closed, and he had heard about the mill through a halfway house counselor who had heard about it through Delia's church network. He said he could do most things physical, and that he was not afraid of heights or confined spaces, and that he would work for room and board while he got himself stable. Ezra looked at him for a moment. He said the room on the end above the diner was available and that Gusta's breakfast was at 7 and work started at 8 and that he would need to show up both places. Isaac said he understood. He showed up both places. He was strong and he worked without complaint, and he had a mechanical aptitude that emerged over the first week in small ways, the instinctive correction of his grip on a wrench before Ezra had said anything, the way he looked at the gear train and turned his head slightly as if listening to it. The question he asked about the relationship between the wheel's speed and the stone rotation that was not a beginner's question. Isaac's particular human moment came on a Sunday evening at the end of his 3rd week, when Ezra found him sitting on the creek bank in the dark after supper. He was not doing anything. He was sitting with his feet near the water and his hands on his knees, and his face turned toward the wheel, which was not yet turning, but was freed from its rust and oiled and waiting. He had the expression of someone who had stopped bracing for a moment and was feeling the unfamiliar quality of that. Ezra sat down beside him on the bank, and they looked at the wheel together in the dark. After a while, Isaac said, "You think it will really turn again?" Ezra said, "I know it will." Isaac was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How do you know?" Ezra said, "Because the water hasn't changed. Water doesn't change what it is just because the wheel stopped turning. It's been waiting to do this for 22 years. Isaac looked at the water for a while after that. Then he said he understood. Ezra thought he probably did. The wheel turned for the first time on a morning in July, a Thursday, with Gusta and Delia and Isaac all present, and the water coming through the rebuilt flume and striking the buckets at the top of the wheel with the sound that Ezra had been hearing in his memory for 12 years. The wheel moved slowly at first, the weight of the accumulated stillness in it, and then with gathering confidence as the water found its rhythm and the timber and iron remembered what they were for. He stood at the base of the wheel housing and felt the vibration of it come through the floor and into his feet and up through his legs and into his chest. A working mill vibrated differently from a still one. The whole building changed when the water moved through it. The stone walls, which had been holding their breath for 22 years, let it out. The millstones engaged at the top of the building with a sound that went through the floor and through the walls and out through the open windows and across the creek, a low, continuous working sound that had not been heard at Sable Ford in 22 years. Gusta put her hands over her mouth and said nothing. Delia wrote something in the notebook she carried and then stopped writing and just stood there. Isaac stood with his arms at his sides and his face completely open, the bracing entirely gone from it. He looked at the wheel turning and at the water coming down the flume, and at the building moving around them in the way that working buildings moved, with purpose, with direction, with the particular aliveness of something doing what it was built to do. He looked at Ezra. Ezra was not looking at any of them. He was looking at the wheel. He was thinking about the morning his grandfather described the wheel turning, the morning Solomon Webb had finished the building and opened the flume for the first time, a morning in 1887 that Ezra's grandfather had been told about and had told Ezra's father about, and his father had told him, the story of the first turning passed down through 3 generations because some things were worth the keeping. The wheel had stopped in 1931, and it was turning again now, and what had been interrupted was not finished, but continuing, and Ezra understood that in his body before he had words for it. He stood at the ground floor window for a long time and listened to the building work, and did not speak. After a while, Gusta came and stood beside him and looked out the window at the creek and at the water going over the wheel, and she said, "I want to call my sister." He said she should call her. She took out her phone and called, and when her sister answered, she said, "You need to come to Sable Ford. The mill is running." The regional historian was a woman named Petra, who contacted Ezra through the County Historical Society 6 weeks after Delia had made the initial contact. She was thorough and specific, an academic who had spent 15 years researching black-owned agricultural enterprises in the rural South, and who understood, when she sat in the ground floor of the Sable Ford mill and read Solomon Webb's ledgers, that she was looking at primary source documentation of historical significance that she had not expected to find intact. She spent 3 days at the mill. She photographed the deed box and its contents. She read every ledger. She stood in front of Solomon's unfinished letter for a long time. She said carefully and precisely that the Webb Sable Ford Mill was one of the most complete surviving records of black agricultural enterprise in the region, and that she would be recommending formal heritage designation through the State Foundation. The designation came 3 months later. A State Heritage Foundation grant came with it. A national publication on reclaimed black economic history ran a long feature that began with the sentence, In 1887, a free man named Solomon Webb built a mill. Preston arrived on a Saturday in October. He came alone, without his usual preparation, which told Ezra something. He parked at the track and walked down to the mill and stood outside it for a moment before he came in, looking at the building the way people looked at things that were not what they expected. The wheel was turning. The sound of it was audible from the track, the low, continuous sound of water and timber and stone doing what they were built to do. He came inside. He walked through the ground floor and looked at Solomon's letter on the wall in its frame, and at the deed box displayed open beside it, and at the ledgers in their case, and at the photographs of the land deed that Petra had helped them document and display. He read the unfinished sentence on the wall. He read it twice. He stood in front of it for a while. Then he walked up to the upper floor and stood beside the French burstone, now fully dressed and running, the runner turning above it, the sound of the grind filling the upper floor. He put his hand flat on the top of the stone housing and felt the vibration of it. He stood there for a while. He came back down and stood in the ground floor and looked at Ezra. He said, "I did not know about any of this. I did not know what this place was." Ezra said, "I know you did not." Preston said, "I thought it was just a mill." Ezra said, "It was never just a mill. Your great-great-grandfather built this place in 1887 and operated it for 44 years and fed half this county and had it taken from him. I have been carrying that pick in my pocket since the day your grandfather died. I thought you knew what that meant." Preston looked at the pick, which was on the workbench near the wall. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "I thought the old things were done. I thought we were past them." Ezra said, "Nothing your people built is done until you say it is, and nobody gets to say it except you." Preston stood there for a long time. Something moved through him that was not quick and was not simple, and was not the kind of thing that resolved in a single conversation. Ezra watched it move and did not rush it. He had spent 34 years working with materials that set in their own time and could not be hurried without cracking, and he understood that a person was no different. Then Preston said he was sorry, not the sorry of a man presenting a case, the sorry of a man who had understood something for the first time and was saying so. Ezra looked at his son. He said, "Come back when you can stay longer. There is a lot here you need to know. It belongs to you too." Camille called on a Sunday in November, late, when the mill was quiet and the creak was audible through the window, and the ground floor was lit by the lamp beside Solomon's letter. Her voice was unsteady in the particular way of someone who has been carrying something a long time and has finally decided to set it down, not because it has gotten lighter, but because they cannot carry it any more. She said she was sorry. She said she had known in the car and every day since what she had allowed to happen, and that she had been trying to find words for it that were adequate and had stopped waiting for adequate and was calling anyway. Ezra said, "The door here is open, Camille. You know where I am? Come when you are ready." She said she would come soon. He said he would be here. The two of them arrived in December, a man and a woman in their 40s, their truck carrying everything they owned, referred by Isaac's halfway house counselor, who had told them about the mill. They pulled into the track at the side of the building and sat in the truck for a moment before they got out, the way people sat when they were deciding whether to trust what they were seeing. Ezra went to the door and opened it, and the sound of the mill came out with the warm air, the low, continuous working sound of the stones and the wheel, and the two of them looked at each other and got out of the truck. He stood back and let them come up the track. He said, "Come inside. It is cold and there is coffee." They came inside. They stood in the ground floor of the mill and looked at Solomon's letter on the wall and at the wheel visible through the open door to the wheel housing, and at the French burstone in its display place near the window where visitors came to see it. They looked at Delia's chalk timeline on the reinstated section of floor, the dates and names and context that she refreshed every week so that anyone who came in walked through Solomon Webb's history before they got to the coffee. They looked at Isaac on the upper floor through the ceiling hatch, working at the gear train with the focused competence of someone who had found the thing his hands were made for. They looked at all of it, and then they looked at Ezra. He said, "There is room, there is work. Those are the only two things we ask of anyone." The woman looked at the man. The man looked at the letter on the wall, at the sentence that did not finish, at the 8 words that said everything the rest of the sentence would have said if Solomon Webb had had the time to finish it. He said, "We can do that." Ezra stepped back and held the door and let them in. His grandfather had built something and lost it. His father had carried the knowledge of it. Ezra had carried the tool. Now the water was turning the wheel again, and what had always been true was true again, and that was enough. If something in Ezra's story reached you today, we want to hear what it was. Leave it in the comments below. And if you know someone who has been carrying the knowledge of something their people built, something the world tried to take and could not fully take because the knowing survived, share this with them. We will be here with another story, and the door, as it always has been, will be open.